to introduce me to you Raguel Matos, who is a Dean of the Faculty of Psychology from Porto University, Catholic University of Porto. And her scientific areas of interest are gender, crime, prisoners, some psychology, social issues, and she will present to us one of her research. So welcome and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Hopefully you understand good, well, the English, because I don't understand a word of your language, and I should. Well, when I come back, I'll try to know at least hello and thank you. But for now, I don't know a single word, so I'm sorry. I really need to present in English. If you don't understand anything that I say, just ask me a question, okay? So it's a pleasure to be here. Before being a dean, well, now I'm occasionally the dean of the faculty, but I'm more important than that. I am a psychologist. All my background is in psychology. My degree, my master. My master was in what we call justice psychology in Portugal. And then I did my PhD again in psychology. And just to tell you a little bit about that, when I did my master, I did my master in a research project, my master thesis in a research project. It was about developmental psychology. It was about, you don't know that, it was about teenage girls that were very my master in justice psychology. I asked my supervisor to introduce some measures about history of abuse. So of abuse and the relation that they were able to establish with their own children. So that was my first research. And then when I moved on to my PhD, I went to something a little bit different. So to still work on young women, but not those who had history of abuse. I wanted to look at offenders. So I did my PhD, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, what I did since my PhD. So I did my PhD about young women in prison. So, hello. Well, in Portugal, we cold weather, but inside the buildings, unfortunately, it's really cold. So I'm not used to this. Hot weather inside, so I need lots of water. Open the window if you want. No, it's fine. It's one open. Maybe I can open one more because it's really. Oops. Okay. So first I have some questions. So my idea is to tell you a little bit about this work to explain. It's well, I work on women's pathways in crime. I'm going to talk a little bit about my pathway into prison, not in crime, but in normative, most of the things, at least in normative things. But I'm going to show you a little bit of what I've been doing, starting from the beginning. And I know your professor told me that you know a lot about offenders and prisons, right? Do you know a lot about? Yes. So I need to tell you about Portugal. I need to know a few things about Poland. Okay. Well, this is the starting point. What you can see here, it was the starting point of my work. So after that work more focusing on victims of crimes. So I moved on to women offenders and to young women offenders. And why did I do that? Because I looked at, I wanted to study women offenders, and I looked at the Portuguese statistics, and I could see that we were in the early, we were in the early 2000, in the beginning of the 21st century. So I started my PhD in 2001 or 2002. can't remember that well, and when I looked at the statistics, do you see the yellow line? I could see that we had more than 10% of our prison population were women. And that's the absolute number. We have our numbers, we were talking a little bit about that. Portugal is a small country, and it's a little bit lower than in Poland, but we have I would say a moderate rates of incarceration is 140 per 140 per 100,000 inhabitants in the country. It's moderate, it's higher in Poland, but in absolute numbers, everything seems small because it's a small country with a small population. For instance,
it's about, maybe we tell to the students that Portugal is about 3 times smaller than Poland.
Yes, it's about 10 million inhabitants in Portugal. Okay, so this was the absolute number. You can see we had about 14,000 prisoners in the country in 1997. It's almost the same number we have again nowadays in Portugal. It's since 1 year ago, it rose up, and I will explain that a little bit later. But what was really amazing in the context of Europe was having a percentage bigger than 10%. That's really unusual. I don't know if you know, and that's my first question. Do you know a lot about prison? You know a lot about offenders, but do you know a lot about or anything about women in prison? Do you know which is the rate? What's the percentage of women in the Polish prison population? Do you know that?
No, grupa, która przygotowała temat Psychologii, powinna pamiętać. One group prepared a presentation about women, so they should remember.
Do you think it's about 10% or lower? Don't worry about the English. My English is, I speak much better Portuguese than English, so.
Of the prison service, yeah, something like that. It's about 4% of the population of the prisoners, people.
How much? How many?
4%.
4%. So you can see that 10% is really huge, and it was really huge. So 5%, and I don't know these days what's the mean rate in Europe, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was about 5% everywhere except in Portugal and in Spain. So I was really curious about that. That was one of the motives. You can see here that things changed. I usually say that I solved the social problems of the country because I started my project with 10%. And then when I finished in 2006, well, it was about 6%. But there was another reason. So I didn't want just to look at, I'm not sure if I know.
To think about a little bit.
I wanted to go back. Should this work?
Yeah, it should work.
Well, I have another question for you. What is the age of criminal responsibility in Poland? You know, when you 18? Okay. I want to go, no. That's it. Because in Portugal, and that's also very unusual in the context of Europe, the age of criminal responsibility is 16. Though the civil age of majority is 18, probably the same as here, is 18, but the criminal responsibility age is 16. And that's, I don't know if you know that, but in other countries it's lower than 16. For instance, in England, I don't know nowadays, but it can be 12, for instance, or 14. But they never send someone below 18 to an adult prison. And in Portugal, we do that. So that's one of our problems. If you commit a crime in Portugal with 16 years, you go to the penal court, to the same court that your father or your mother does. So that's something that annoys me to use it's really, we should change that thing. So, and I was really curious about that 20 years ago. There is a special act, there is a special law saying that if you commit a crime, so we have our juvenile justice system we have our protection system until the age of 11. If you commit a crime, if you can say so, until 11, it's the protection law. Then if you commit a crime between 12 and 15, it's our youth justice law or act. And if you commit a crime with 16 or more years of age, you go to the common penal, you are judged under the penal law. But there is a special act for young people from 16 to 21 years old who commit crimes. Depending on the crime and depending on the sentence that corresponds to the crime, you can go to you can have a different measure, more easily a non-custodial measure. Do you understand that? If you were 18, you would probably, or 21 or 22 or more than that, with that crime, you would go to prison. But with 16 and until 20, you can stay with a community measure, for instance. So it's a very beautiful law. The idea is very good, but I've been studying that as well in the last years. And in fact, it's not that much applied. It's really, it's more in the paper, as some laws that we have, it's more in the paper than in the practice. And I was really curious about that. So when I decided that I wanted to study young women from 16 to 21 in Portuguese prisons in 2001, do you know how many of them were in the Portuguese prisons? Can you guess? We had about 1,000 women in prisons, and do you guess how many were from 16 to 20? Can you just say a number?
100.
100? Well, 52. So it was really, you can see this in a very optimistic or a very pessimistic point of view. An optimistic point of view is that I had the chance to study the universe of these young women. The pessimistic is that you may think that it wasn't worth studying that population. Well, I believe that it was, and I did it. In the end, I did it. So I went. By then, we had just one prison for women, and that's something that I don't know in Poland as well. Do you have prisons just for women? Yes, and many, or one or two? You were very, you don't know, but can you help? Because I really want to know. It's not just to ask you questions.
Yeah, in our Katowice Inspectorate of Prison Services, we have a prison for women in Lubliniec, in Katowice, but not whole prison, but just one ward. Gdzie jeszcze w Katowicach są to kobiety? Lubliniec, Katowice. I think just two prison for women in Katowice Inspectorate of Prison Services.
Yes, but in the country you must have several.
10, maybe 10.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. For my master thesis, I was visiting prisons for women, and I have to travel all around Poland, because we have really not many. And the whole number of prisons is maybe 100, something like that. So 10%.
For women.
Yes.
Okay, because when I started to do this study, we only had one near Lisbon, which is the capital that you probably know. We only had one. And then we had women in all the prisons of the country, which is not a big country, so it was easy to travel around the country. And we had women in small parts of the prisons, so they were not adapted at all to some things that women need in prison, and especially for children, because women can have children in prison with them. I was telling your professor that since some years ago, men can also have children until 3 or in some cases until 5, but that never happened. But the law says that we can have children in males prison as well. So when I started, so I also needed to travel in the country, and I was able to reach 49 of the 52. So I was able to make interviews, very structured interviews in a first part, and I will tell you a little bit more about that. And then I chose some of them to make in-depth interviews, so more qualitative study. So it's really a thinker.
We are transmitting it. I am checking if it works on my telephone. Yeah, so it's too much for the computer.
Well, I can talk without that, but it's not the same. Well, I believe the next slide.
I try to also load
I can open
this, okay? And maybe
no. Let's wait a little bit. You can see here and wait for that to work.
Meanwhile, I try to also load the
Well, just to move on a little bit. And I can talk without slides, but I know it's even worse because I talk a lot. I'm sorry for that. I won't come again. It's just today. The third topic is to explain that I should explain to you is my theoretical background, because I told you in the beginning that I am a psychologist, but for my empirical work and for my research work, my look to these topics is not a psychological look. So I'm a criminology teacher. I teach one of the disciplines that I teach is criminology or theories of crime. And for future psychologists that just like you are willing to focus on forensic psychology, what we believe is that you need all the psychological background and knowledge, but you also need to have a broader look. You need to think besides the psychological variables. So it's just, I believe that I'm not saying anything that you won't listen here. It's really important, and what's distinctive of psychologists is knowing about psychology and about psychological basic processes. That's really important if you want to make psychological evaluation, forensic psychological evaluation. But it's not just about, you can't be just inside the psychological box. You may have, you really need, it's not in May, you really need to look at some social dynamics around people who commit crimes, around offenders, that are really important to
we try to figure out the presentation. Sorry.
Okay, so here you have the presentation and here it's recording, right? So that I need this, okay. Okay, so. Okay, so going back to what I was saying is I'm sure that you are learning a lot about making psychological evaluation or assessments or even intervention, psychological intervention. But I believe that you should know a little bit about theories of crime. So, I mean, I am particularly interested in looking at or studying women who commit crimes and their life trajectories. I had to face with the feminist perspectives in criminology. So theories of crime that look at a dimension which is really important, in my opinion, which is gender. Gender relation, gender processes. So I was really curious since my first work in looking at women who commit crimes. As I was telling you in my first work, young women who commit crimes, trying to understand their criminal pathways, but with a more social lens or look. And I was very much concerned with gender. How is being a young woman important in having committed a crime? That was one of my concerns. Just to this background that you can see here in this slide is the basis of the feminist criminology theories. So I don't know if you are familiar with that. Maybe you don't have, I don't know. The first theories, we have lots of theories about crime. Some are very psychological focus, like criminal personality, for instance. You have some theories about that. And the more traditional and the first theories were very much focused on biological characteristics of the offender, psychological characteristics, were very focused on men and on male processes or criminal pathways. So then, in the 1960s, some feminist authors were very critical about the way theories of crime were being built and discussed. It was just about men. It was theories done by men about men. And when someone decided to look at women who committed crime, it was a very first of all, women were seen, and they still are, as double deviants because they were criminals. They were deviants because they were not complying with the rules, with the law, but also because you never expect that a woman commits a crime. That's the double deviance. So the feminists were very critical about that. The idea that women just commit specific crimes, if you go back to the 19th century first theories, it was like female offending was like prostitution or was mixed with superstition. Women who committed crimes were prostitutes or witches or were male women were very masculine, for instance. So a normal woman would never commit a crime. And when committing crimes, they would commit specific crimes. For instance, something very like, and in specific ways, you know, the idea that of the poisoning, the idea of instead of using other types of weapons, and that was, the feminists were also very critical about that. Why not considering that women can commit all types of crimes? I'm not going to develop a lot of theories, but just to tell you that some the first feminists were really eccentric in saying they were so critical about this that they, at some point, some of them, like Frida Adler, some of them were saying like, well, women are worse than men. They really can commit crimes. They can be very, they really turn the discourse the other way around. And that was criticized, of course. The other idea that they were very critical about was the idea that of irrationality, that a normal, rational woman, if a woman thinks about that, would never commit a crime, would never decide for a crime. And that's the autodetermination, which for the traditional theories was never at play. Well, a woman would never decide rationally for crime. So the feminists were really critical about that. They started to criticize and try to, and motivating studies to show that things can be different. And my work was a little bit inspired by these theories. I won't say it's a feminist work, but it's inspired by feminist critics and feminist theories. So I'm going to first show you what I did. Are you going to make research work?
Yeah. Your thesis should be the recent work.
Yes, but not this year, right? Next year?
No, after this year. Yeah,
After?
they defend
Okay.
the master thesis.
Okay.
So they write it for 1.5 years now.
Okay. And you have research methods, disciplines? Yeah, okay. So this work, because I'll try to show you some methodological concerns, okay, and some methodological strategies that I think are useful or can be useful when studying this. So this, what I wanted to show you is a combined work, or the combined result of the work I did with the young women, the work of my PhD. So I went to interview young women in prison, and with questions that I will show you inspired by the feminist theories. But I also interviewed professionals who worked with young people who commit crimes, and I tried to compare the discourses of the young girls and the discourses of the professionals. And they are really different. It's really, so for the study with young women, and I wanted to study young women from 16 to 20. When I told you about the act, the act excludes 21. If you commit a crime with 21, you're excluded of the act. So I wanted from 16 to 20, but of course I did a longitudinal work. So at some point, some of them were 21 or even 22. So my questions were this: how do young women in prison make sense of crime in their life trajectories? So that I wanted them to tell me, how did crime happen in your life? What's the role of crime in your life history? I was really ambitious because I had an interview script, very narrative. And as you know, as psychologists, it's really difficult with 16 or 17 years old to have this ability to have a cognition, to go back and to reflect on your life. I was really ambitious, but it really worked. In the end, it worked well. So I wanted to know about their crime and past experiences, about being in prison, their expectations for the future. How did they see prison as something that was part of their lives or as an interruption? I also wanted to look at gender constraints. Was their involvement in crime, was there something specific or related to the fact that they were women or not? And I wanted them to tell me that. I also wanted to look at drugs to see if it was an important issue, to the way they looked at justice and to previous experiences of abuse. So I told you, so I was able to reach 49 of the 52 young women, and I was able to make a first very structured interview. I don't know if you know that, but if you go to prison and if you analyze case files, you know, the files of the prisoners, you have lots of contradictions, lots of contradictory information from reports of the social services, from the judge, you have from the police, you have lots of, so nothing like, so I looked at the files, but I made interviews and tried to manage the contradictions. That's something that you can't, in fact, escape. So I made interviews to 49 of these women. With a structure, it was a kind of a questionnaire, so I was interviewing them, but I had a very closed, very structured, really interview. And what I could see was that drugs was really an important issue. Not only because, as you can see, 71.9%, and I have to say that, and that's, nowadays I'm much more cautious than I was by then. To look at, to assume in the same study, convicted women and women who remain in custody. Do you understand the difference? Those who are already convicted by the judge, or those who are in prison but are still being in trial.
Osadzone I tymczasowo aresztowane, nie?
Okay, so these 49, I couldn't throw away any of them. So I interviewed those who were convicted and those who were still in trial, okay? So when I say that 71.9% of them were in prison for trafficking, some of them were not convicted, were being judged by trafficking, okay? So, well, when you send someone with between 16 and 20 to prison, the most of them will be convicted, most of them. In fact, some of them may not, or at least to a prison sentence. But it's not just about the crime related to drugs, it's also about drugs used before detention and broadly, not just problematic drugs use, but and things have changed. That's one of the fascinating things about prison. It's because it's really important to make work throughout the years and to compare and to see how things change. This would be different 20 years later. The types of crimes, trafficking was a huge percent of crimes committed by women in prison in Portugal. I don't know here. If it's trafficking, drugs, trafficking, no?
I have no idea.
Okay. But in Portugal, it was really for young or adult women was really a very high proportion, as you can see. But most of them were not drug users, as you can see. And this number, now things are a little bit, now we have more drugs used among women who are in prison, but it was a really different reality comparing to men, because you can see that 1/3 of these young women were drug users before going to prison, and with men, it's the other way around, it's 2/3, like 66 or 67% of men who are in prison are drug users. And in most of them, the crime is related to that. Another thing that in these 49 first interviews I could see was that there was a lot of family stuff around crime. So many of them had relatives or friends or neighbors, because we have lots of neighborhoods where the entire family is in prison, and I could see in these girls that almost all of them had relatives or neighbors. So it was a little bit strange because they knew each other, you know, like in the main prison for women in Porto near Lisbon, at some point, the yard was like the neighborhood, you know, they were chatting. Well, sometimes there was a rival, you know, there was someone that they couldn't meet in the neighborhood, and the prison staff had to manage that.
So you mean that the prison for women in Portugal are near Lisbon? Yeah.
Near Lisbon?
Yeah.
No, at that time, now we have 3.
Okay.
I forgot to tell that when I started, we had just one in Lisbon, in the capital,
okay,
close to Lisbon. But then in the last 20 years, things have changed a lot. We have a new prison for women, new with 10 years, close to Porto. And another close to Algarve, you know, in the south of the country.
Okay, because if it was just one, the family members can have long distance to visit.
Yeah, that was a huge problem. That was a huge problem. Did you understand having just one prison? Well, even nowadays you have, well, it's a small country, but if you live close to Spain, Porto and Lisbon are close to the sea. You can look at the map later. Are close to the sea, and then you have our border close to Spain. If you live there, it's really difficult to reach to go for daily visits, of course. Yes. So it's still a difficult.
How many kilometers is from the coast to the?
It's like 200.
Okay.
It's really small. You can travel from the northern part of the country to the beach in the south in 6 hours.
Okay. So to 1 hour visit, it's quite, but for 1 hour visit.
Yes, but for 1 hour visit,
quite
no,
long.
Of course not, yeah.
Even to 200 kilometers, yeah.
Even 200, yeah. You can take 2 hours, or more. Well, and then so they had lots of friends, neighbors, relatives. But what I could see was that it wasn't about organized crime, because if you look at the picture, like women in prison for drug trafficking with family, friends and neighbors, don't you think about the organized crime? No, you don't think about that? Yeah. So you can think that all the family members had a traffic business or something like that. And in fact, I didn't see that. It was really funny because in some cases, they were in prison, their mother was in prison, their sister or cousin, their father and brothers were in a male prison, and they were trafficking by themselves, independently. They weren't organized at all. What was really very clear was that they lived in areas where traffic was not a business opportunity. So it was really, well, it was more of an opportunity than in the regular work market. And that was obviously a problem for these neighborhoods. What I could also see in these first interviews was, and do you remember I was telling you that I was inspired by the feminist perspectives who were very critical about the traditional theories, saying that women only committed some specific crimes. And what I could see just in this first study and in these interviews with just the young offenders was that there was, even though 71.9% were in prison for trafficking, but that some of them were also for other types of crimes, and others were just for homicides, others were for fraud, for instance. So it was really heterogeneous, and that was interesting. This is in Portuguese, so I'm sure you don't, well, I don't know, maybe you understand. I tried with this data from the 49 structured interviews. I tried to make a cluster analysis. And
analiza skupień, bo nie wiem, czy Państwo kojarzycie z metodologii, tak? Okay.
I tried to make a cluster analysis, and what I asked the cluster analysis was to look particularly to drugs. Well, you have here crimes. Do you see? No. Do you see any familiar words? No.
Crimes, yeah.
Crime is the same in English and in
Contra justice.
Crimes against property. You can see crimes against property. So I put in the cluster analysis the type of crime. So drug offenses, crimes against the property, and crimes against the person. So these big labels. Here you have with justice, a justice pathway. You know, even being young, I could see that some of them had files with the police, had previous had files in the youth justice system, had lots, or had some trial before this one. So they have a history and a path in justice, but in the other, here you can see without any path in justice. So that was another variable I put in the cluster analysis. The other one was with or without drugs use, and the other one was having or not family relatives involved in crime.
But you mean with or without drugs committing crime under?
Types of crime was one variable.
Yeah.
Trafficking, property.
Yeah, but you mean the under the drugs or without? Yeah.
Yeah.
During committing
No,
crime.
not during. No.
Okay. At all.
Just
General.
reporting.
Okay.
Yes, just
Okay.
general, not related with the crime. Okay. Or not related, not under.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean that.
And here you can see what the analysis told me, and I'm mostly a qualitative researcher, I have to say that, but as a research methods teacher, what I really agree is that there isn't the best method, there is the best method for your research question. And I'm a defender of the mixed methods approach, as you'll see, because in most of my study about prison population, I use both. So I started with, when you have a mixed method approach, there is always a main approach, and here is the qualitative, as you'll see, but I started with a quantitative approach, okay? So what the cluster analysis told me was that there was a tendency to group these women in 3 different clusters. This one is young women with a path in the justice system, with drugs use and in prison for property crimes. That was one cluster. In the other side, and with relatives involved in crime, it's also in this side. In the other side, young women without any path in the justice system, without drugs use, without relatives involved in crime, and in prison for crimes against the person. So it was a total different cluster. And this one is just in prison for drug trafficking and with relatives involved in crime. And the drugs use wasn't a relevant variable. So I use this not as a result, but as a methodological strategy to choose my sample for the main study, the qualitative one. So what I did was to interview 3 or 4 young women of each of these cluster, plus what I call a negative case, which I was looking for a young woman who didn't meet any of this cluster. It's an important strategy for the qualitative methodology. It's a way of confirming or not your findings. So I did my PhD with 12 interviews, which I don't know. Does it sound bad?
Not at all. If you have less than 60 population
In this universe,
yeah.
In a universe of 52, 12 is not that bad.
Yes, exactly.
It's not. Yeah. Well, it's not the number. You cannot expect a number. It depends if you reach what I did. You should reach theoretical saturation. Do you know the concept? It's when you make interviews and you can't listen to anything new. That's a validity strategy for qualitative research. So what I did was starting with 1 interview in each cluster, and then a second interview in each cluster, and then a third interview in each cluster. And at some point, I started to feel that I didn't hear anything new. And then I interviewed a negative case. In the end, and that's why I really think that there is really very important quantitative research, but for this research question, it wouldn't be enough. Because in the end, I have 4 ways of making sense of crime, and they are not exactly matching these clusters. They are they are in fact different clusters or ways of clustering. I really talked a lot. Sorry. Okay, so I saw that. So this was a sample. This is, of course, these are not real names. Okay, so I always choose, I start with a name, starting with an A, the second with a B, a C, a D. That's my strategy. So you find Alexandra, Barbara, A, B, C. So it's really the crime, the sentence, previous primary sentences, words used, family and crime. So I had all this data before the interviews, and then I made in-depth interviews. As I told you before, I chose a very, very interesting, and I've been using it for other totally different studies. It's a script for the narrative construction of life stories, but imagine with some of them were teenagers, so it was really a challenge. Some of the interviews I needed more than one moment with these young women, and it's really an interesting interview because you ask the person to divide the life in chapters. It's really narrative. So imagine, I didn't say like imagine your life is a book. I would say imagine it's a novel, for instance. You know, how do you say novella? Novel. You know, or
The short
I adapted
book.
a little bit, or a TV show. Imagine it's a TV show. Would you divide in chapters? In how many chapters? Can you name each chapter and tell me the main things that happen in each chapter? So it was really interesting. And of course, in each chapter, I wanted to know about family, about deviant behavior, about drugs, about school, about everything. And then I asked them to choose life scenes, the high point of their lives, the low points, turning point, decision-making, crime, prison scene, challenge, Okay, and I did a grounded analysis. We also know about that. I didn't have categories, previous categories, so I started just reading the interviews and building categories, and well, and I won't transform this in a research methods class, but it's a really challenging process. Not for a PhD, I think it's okay. For a master thesis, it can be challenging. It's better to have an approach inspired by grounded, but not that grounded.
I think that correlation analysis is most popular in master thesis.
Yeah. Nothing like, yes, and I think it's a good strategy.
I will excuse you for 1 minute.
Okay. So I found you're not enjoying. I'm really sad. Nothing like a smooth way. So I found, as I told you, I started with three clusters, but in the end, after these qualitative interviews and the grounded analysis, I found 4 different ways of making sense of crime. I'm glad that it's also hot for you, right? So the first one I called deviance, identity, criminal lifestyle. So these were young women even with these ages, I told you, from 16 to 20, with significant trajectories in terms of deviancy and formal responses, contacts with the police, with the courts, etc. Previous intense and heterogeneous criminal activity. And most of them had several criminal behaviors. Crimes against the property, but also a little bit of trafficking, crimes against the person. So it was a very mixed criminal activity. And I could see here in these girls' discourses or narratives 2 central dimensions. The first one was a control dimension. And I can give you several examples when they talked about, and I didn't bring quotes of the interviews, but it's really nice to read some quotes. Some of these girls were talking about the way, how they could manage to use drugs, even hard drugs, but controlling. If I had money, I would use drugs. If I didn't have, I wouldn't use. I was in control. I could control the situation. So that was really something very strong in their discourses, the control. Being proud of living on the street, that was also, I have some really nice quotes about the excitement of going to an abandoned house and taking care of it, like changing the locker, you know, the key locker, like making something to have water, and they would talk really with excitement about that. And it was really interesting the way they talked about criminal activity, because it seemed to be this proud and control. It seemed to be a way of having control over their lives. And this was, as you can imagine, this was very different from the traditional theories of crime from Lombroso. Have you heard about Lombroso? No? About the idea of this criminal man with even with a particular face, and the women who don't commit crimes, and this is really different. This idea of having women, or young women in this case, talking about control when they talk about crime or using drugs, and about pleasure or excitement associated to crime. So I heard very funny stories about, when I asked about, tell me the best scene about your criminal activity. And then you have a girl saying, oh, it was really funny. I went there with a gun, and then he was really scared. And then with a face of joy, you know, it was really pure excitement. Of course, if in the next phase of the interview, if I asked, did you enjoy that life? Oh no, I will never do that again. You know, like, no, I had to do that, because if you ask directly, of course, but that's the fascinating thing of the qualitative. If you make a good interview, throughout the interview, you can reach the inconsistencies, the contradictions. You can see that somewhere you have a different answer. And that was really interesting here. But of course, when I asked them, why did you do that? Because I had to. If I could choose, I wouldn't do that. That's the self-presentation as hetero-determined. It wasn't their choice. It was someone else or some factors. Then the transition identity, deviant means for normative identities. And then there was this group of young women who were drug dealers without drugs use. We also with a dimension of control, with a clear option for the criminal activity. And they had a very normative life, you know, but their job was being a drug dealer. That was the only thing. So they had a job which, by chance, almost by chance, wasn't according to the law. But it was really deviant means for normative identities. And then a third group of women who presented themselves as victims of crimes, and these were boring interviews, you know, women with with drugs use, very problematic drugs use, they told me that they considered that they shouldn't be in prison because they were victims of drugs and victims of violent partners. So they shouldn't be there. It wasn't fair. It was this victimization narrative. They were, well, you can ask me, weren't they saying that just to convince you that they were not guilty? I don't see that in this kind of work. If I'm a judge or if I'm a forensic psychologist and I'm interviewing to make a report to the judge, then I need to, I'm on a different mission and I need to know how to make sense of what women, in this case, are telling me. Here, it's a totally different scenario, okay? I'm not on the same mission. I'm trying to understand how these women make sense. And here you have room for this. Lack of control, so it's the opposite. It's what they call the drugs life. It wasn't me, it was drugs. It was drugs took care of my life. And it was, the way they saw their own criminal activity was very according to the traditional theories that saw women who commit crimes as irrational and engaged in crime because of other people. And they talked about crime in their lives in that same pathological way. And then I found what I call the normative identity. And these were girls that didn't at all saw them as deviants or as offenders or as delinquents. They had a normative life. They were good students. They were good daughters, you know, everything was really normative. But at some points of their young lives, they committed horrendous crimes in most of the cases. Like one killed the baby, a newborn baby, because she was abandoned by the family and by the boyfriend, and even with some psychological disturbed, but she was convicted. She had a huge sentence. Or another girl killed an abusive stepfather, for instance. Or another one killed her boyfriend. She was really super controlled by her parents. And when she finally got a boyfriend, she was really obsessed. And like in a movie, like in NCIS, you know, that was really, and she killed her boyfriend. And these were, so here we have girls with a very problem.
Yeah.
So these were girls with a very normative life. And their crimes were really gender-related crimes, much more than all the others. And it was just one crime in their lives, but they had severe sentences because the crimes were really serious. And then there was the negative case. Do you remember I told you that I also considered the negative case a girl that didn't match any of the cluster. And it was really a funny case because it was a girl who could tell me about two different lives, two different lifestyles taking place in different times of the day or of the week in different places. She had the day life, very normative, good girl at school, helping the family. But then in the night, you know, in the underground, she was engaged in a deviant group. And it was a kind of a gang, you know. So she had a very serious conviction because they killed someone was taking care of a place where they entered, they had guns. So, and it was really funny when I asked her, what is your main life? So if you had to choose, well, it's my day life. I like to study, I like my family. I know that, but I really can't live without the game. So there was a joy and adrenaline, you know, and I don't know where is this girl now, but I can guess that she's still engaged in any kind of activity.
Connected to the relationship she had with this gang, like the bond she was sharing with them. Like, I know if we also have her private relationship with her brother on the daily life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to know two relationships which she could hold on to. She could hold on to the
She could.
Yeah.
She could. She had a very strong relation with the family. It wasn't, if you want to look at any kind of compensation, trying to bond, attachment figures, or anything like that, you can't make sense of it. It was really, and as a psychologist, I can say it's adrenaline, it's a biological, I can't say that, but she was so functional from a psychological and emotional. It's really a case study. It's real. Well, it's not. If I for all the groups or all these four narratives, I would say that this one is must be much less frequent. Okay, one of the things that we should think of is that even though I was really interested in gender, I don't know if it sounds like that to you, but when you look at these results, you can understand that this is specific of young women. You can see here lots of similarities with delinquency, youth delinquency studies and results. There's adrenaline and there's, so this was, then I moved on to studying adults, women. Here you have the gender things, some specific things because they were women, but you also have lots of things about being a young person, in fact. One of the important things of this negative case is that if you can see, she mixes the deviant identity and the normative identity. And it's really important in the qualitative results. It's the opposite of, I don't want, my aim of the study is not to have a general rule where all the cases can be put in. And this negative case tells us that even if you can portray the reality, saying that women can make sense like this or like this or like this, with this case, you can say, or you should say that, but there will always be one case that won't meet any of the clusters. And that's part of the qualitative research. So it's not about making general laws or 100% rules that explain 100% of the reality. So, okay, so this study, and I want to talk at least about the professionals. We stop at 5, right?
Yes, 20 minutes.
Do you want to make any question? No? Okay, so do you remember I was very much inspired by the feminist perspectives that were saying that we need a fresh look at women offenders because the traditional end of the 19th century look and the first half of the 20th century isn't enough, isn't considering all the options. It's very narrow. And here I could see that, I could confirm that I could question the traditional approaches to female criminality. I could see multiple trajectories, different ways of making sense of crime. I could see the dimension of pleasure and control, rationality, decision, or self-determination. And it was really an evidence that traditional approaches weren't enough to explain women who commit crimes. I could also conclude that there were some opportunities for women in the crime markets, like a particular space in the drug dealing business, in deviant groups, but gender roles established within mixed deviant groups. I could see that when they were parts of deviant groups, when they talked about that, they reproduce the gender roles as we are used to in our society. So men had a role in the group and they, as women, had a different role in the group. That's really something that is still a clear dimension when you listen to these narratives. Okay, I'm moving forward to the professionals, because as I told you at the beginning, so this was data, research data directly from young women who had committed crimes and were able to tell me how did they make sense of crime. And then I had a project about where I had a chance to interview professionals who work with youth delinquency. I wanted to understand how professionals make sense of girls' involvement in deviant paths. It was a project about youth gangs or violent groups, because in Portugal, one of the conclusions of the study, it was a European study in 8 countries, more southern European countries. And the conclusion was that we don't have real gangs in Portugal, especially comparing to Spain, where there are many Latino gangs. In Portugal, well, things have developed in a different way. We have now we have gangs, but not 20 years ago. But the project was about that. So it was about, do you think we have gangs? How would you define gangs in Portugal? And then we introduced a sub-study about what's the role of girls inside the gangs. And we tried to, we interviewed 43 professionals, and we tried to have a range of different roles and different roles in dealing with youth delinquency. So we had, from the justice system, police officers, well, justice system broadly, police officers, magistrates, youth justice practitioners, I don't know how you call that, but in the youth justice system, you have...
Coś takiego, ale kuratorzy może.
They can be psychologists or not, but they have case files in...
Yeah, but you mean working in institution or
they work in a
supervising
formal state intervention with youth
and
delinquency.
supervising, for example, people who are not in prison yet or something
Well,
like
not in
that?
prison. When I say youth justice practitioner, they deal with the young people who commit crimes from 12 to 15.
Okay, no to tacy kuratorzy myślę nasi.
But they can have a measure until they are 21.
Okay.
They can deal with these young people until 21. And then we have since community measures, or since, well, in the minor cases, they just go to the judge, and the judge, reprehends, saying, but then they can go to a kind of youth prison. It's the most severe sentence or measure. So we have 16 from the justice system, 8 from the protection system, because we can have very young people committing with behavior that would be crime if they had age for that, and we were also interested in that. Professionals from community institutions, we have a huge network of community institutions. We have a very famous program and very well-succeeded program called Escolhas. Escolhas is a Portuguese word for choices. It's a national funding for community projects to prevent juvenile delinquency, and we could reach some of their facilities, universities, some researchers, and one clinical psychologist that work with delinquency. And what was really interesting was that the discourses of the professionals were very different from the discourses of the girls. And of course, they should be different, but in making sense, in telling me their own perspectives about why do girls commit crimes, and then particularly in groups, in deviant groups, it was really a very traditional and very stereotyped way of looking at crimes committed by girls. There is a male, these are quotes from the interviews, and this is just a small sample of the quotes. There is a male and a female delinquency. Girls' deviance is more related to running away from home, early pregnancy, and this is just not many years ago, just recently, stealing in stores, stealing perfumes. So it was a really very narrowed way of considering all the options. But then there was an opposite discourse from the same professionals. There are more and more girls committing crimes, each year more and more. Girls are becoming more violent. Girls are having a more active and significant role in delinquency, particularly in delinquent groups. You know that when starting to leave now, right? I'm going to end in this when I finish the results of this study. The thing is that about women, and that's where I was telling you I'm not a feminist. I agree, and I'm concerned with some feminist concerns, but I don't like any radical issues, so I'm a moderate feminist. But in fact, when you dig into these issues, you clearly understand that when it's about women, people tend to polarize the narratives, or it's very good, or it's very bad, or it's a saint or an angel, or it's a witch, or really. So you can feel that when you make research about that. And I have 3 daughters, so I'm really sensitive about the topic. I became more sensitive about the topic when I started to listen to people saying me things like, oh, so cute, it must be really nice to have 3 daughters. So, oh, 4 of you, how can you deal with such thing at home? They must be hysterical, you know? So it's, when it's about women, it's about being a woman. So that's, and if you are interested in that, there are lots of studies about, very interesting studies about judges and about the trials and about gender, how much gender interferes in judicial decision making. And the interesting thing is that women are not more penalized than men when they are judged, but they are more seen or considered because of their gender role, and that can work in their favor or against them. But being a mother or being everything that we expect for a woman is also always a topic of the in the courts. And here that was very clear. Very polarized speeches. Oh no, it's not the same. They just make some particular things. Oh no, they're really bad. I can see that. When there is, I think that I have a quote here. They say girls don't assume leading roles. I can't imagine a girl as a leader. Okay, I think their role is limited. They end up being the women, the girlfriends. Many girls are strategic, and these are quotes from the interviews, are strategically used by boys for several purposes. For example, to outwit the police, to distract the police. So if you see a vehicle late at night with 4 people inside, it may be a bit suspicious. If you see 2 couples inside the vehicle, it no longer becomes suspicious. These days, many women are used. So, well. I think I'm not sure, but when this kind of speeches is, I even can tell you that some of the worst narratives are from women. And I don't have this, I don't like this idea when I listen that women are the worst enemy of themselves. That's not true. I don't like that. It doesn't make sense, but it's the same. We all use the same common backgrounds. We all have the same stereotypes, being a woman, a man, or a mixed something, which that was something that I could also see, was that the professionals are really very traditional in terms of gender. It's, you know, like the heterosexual relation, that's the couple is, so it's all part of the package here. A girl helps these guys. We are less suspicious of girls, so it may be useful to have girls in the group. So this idea that they are used. And you can hear from 2 women answering to your question. In cases that I have worked, women end up acting in a much more primary way, hit more and hit each other more, and have a very clear sense of burglary and then they can steal in a more shocking way comparing to many boys. I think we are still having less violence because there aren't many girls offending. When we start having more, I think we'll have more violence. I think that girls are much more capable to act violently and to enhance physical aggression. This is shocking news for me. This was shocking news and still is shocking news. Why do you think you agree with this? Yeah. No. There's not a right answer or a wrong answer. It's someone's perspective. That's
It's less traditional, like traditional approach, like one said that we are more people than heaven.
the problem. You don't have any evidence of this. When you look at any kind of criminal data, you don't have any evidence that girls eat more violently. You don't have that. So you need to balance with data. So when you hear someone saying this, it has to be a matter of expectations. Of course, if you don't expect someone to commit a crime, when you face with that person's crime, your narrative is more probably like this one. It has to be a matter of expectations because someone who works in the justice system doesn't have any evidence of having more violence from women. So that's my opinion. It's not, I understand the narrative, but I know that data, the official numbers don't match. I have to say that I'm not going to tell, don't worry, I have another, just to tell you that I have much work on youth delinquency, but I chose to just the gender work and about the gender work. So I started with the girls, the end of young women offenders and the professionals about the young women offenders. Then when I finished this work, I realized that we had a very high percentage of foreign national women in prison. It was above 30% of the women in prison were from other nationalities. So I developed a study about that. You can read if you're interested on that. I can send you if you. And then I became more interested in detention centers for migrants, you know, so people who are imprisoned but who had not committed crimes. So it's really a very tough reality. I was going to tell you something in my program. Well, let me ask you if you have questions. Any questions? Hope this was useful for future psychologists. I really believe that I go back to the beginning. To be a very good forensic psychologist, I think you need to have a look for other disciplines. You need to look into law and to deal and to dialogue with the law language, which is really different with sociology, anthropology. You need to put that person with that psychological processes, with those emotions, you need to put that person in context. That's my opinion. You need to, just to tell you that besides, well, I'm a university teacher and I have lots of research work, and my intervention work nowadays is group intervention in prison. Now I'm not having funding, so I stopped. But most of my work is in women's prison setting. And it's really, I have all the evidence that I've been collecting tells me that sometimes you have exactly the same crime. You have, but you need to look at not just for some psychological aspects that you need to be strong at, of course, that's your job, but you don't look just at that. You need to look at the entire picture. So that would be, I don't know, my conclusion for today. So it's really sad that you don't have any questions.
We had during the presentation.
Yes, we had some, yeah.
Okay, so we are really thankful to have you here. If you have more questions, maybe later, you gave your email.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Right.
So
Just show up in Portugal whenever you want.
yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Raquel.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you.